Today's guest is Jacob Helberg. Jacob is a senior advisor at the Stanford University Center on Geopolitics and Technology and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is also currently co-chair of the China Strategy Initiative Working Group at the Brookings Institution. From 2016 to 2020, Jacob led Google's global internal product policy efforts to combat disinformation and foreign interference. As a policy advisor, Jacob led the implementation of Google's most complex global news policy initiatives. These included the company's global policy and enforcement processes against state-backed foreign interference, misinformation, and actors undermining election integrity. Jacob is also the author of Wires of War, Technology, and the Global Struggle for Power, in which he details the existential threat a rising China poses to the United States and the world. Jacob, with everything going on in the world right now, we really thank you for being here with us and lending us your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to be here with you. Certainly want to spend some time on your book and later discuss the war we're seeing unfold in the Ukraine. I think to set the table, maybe we can begin with your time at Google, the experience you had getting your arms around the scope of foreign interference in the 2016 election. I feel like there was this sort of moment of aspect dawning in Silicon Valley, and you were at the heart of that, really starting to get your arms around the growing sophistication of Putin's propaganda efforts and just the nature of the interference in the 2016 election. So can you tell us a little bit about your time at Google?
Absolutely. So I joined Google and started working on news policy at an incredibly interesting time because as folks will remember, in the early 2010s, the consensus in the policymaking world was that the internet was a force for political liberation. We all remember images during the Arab Spring of protesters in Tahrir Square organizing on Twitter, using social media to assemble, express their views, and ultimately topple regimes, decades long of authoritarian regimes that had been in place for a very, very long time. And what happened is that moment spurred a lot of authoritarian regimes, but particularly in Russia and China, to essentially race for their survival, to figure out a way to centralize their political control over the internet. And what we saw by the mid-2010s, 2014, 2015, 2016, was that Russia had developed this new experimental tactic of using the internet and particularly American platforms to conduct information operations. And at the time, it was experimental more than a refined art. And essentially what happened in 2016, by the time I joined Google, was this had become a new emerging issue where ultimately that they had deployed on a very large scale in the US, but as well as other countries and across party lines to try to ultimately discredit democracy. All of their efforts, the narratives were very different at different points in time, but they all converged over the meta level objective of ultimately doing the bidding of autocracy and discredit democracy. And so when I worked at Google, it was kind of a moment where Silicon Valley was experiencing an awakening of sorts of this new reality where geopolitics was starting to change the way that tech companies were looking at the internet and the open and free internet. And very quickly, as my work at Google progressed, I realized, through conversations with people across the tech industry, that there was an even broader pattern at work beyond just foreign interference, but where governments were using dual-use technologies to jockey for political power around the world. And ultimately, I talk about this holistically as a gray war that had two fronts, the front end and the back end, which we can get into a little later in this conversation. But ultimately, on the front end, Russia, at the software level of the internet, Russia was engaged in info ops. And on the back end, at the hardware level of the internet, China was aggressively engaged in trying to spread Huawei and ZTE. But I know that we're going to talk about this quite a bit later, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you for laying that out. I do have to say, reading your book was eye-opening. I think it's an incredibly important read. For me, as the reader, we really did was take this wide swath of events and trends that I think most of us have encountered in the headlines in recent years, just around election interference, foreign disinformation campaigns, cybersecurity breaches, these Orwellian applications of AI, all things that I'd kind of encountered in the news. But you package them together in a way where I could see how all these different data points that I had kind of a cursory understanding of fit together in the greater geopolitical context. And I could really see quite clearly the existential risks that have materialized in the last decade as a function of all this technological innovation, how these risks relate to each other, as well as the implications of these emerging technologies going forward if the world continues to bend away from a more liberal democratic order towards autocratic global leadership. So I thank you for that education, because these were things that I kind of encountered at a tangential level, but you really brought a lot of clarity to them. So I guess I'd ask you, when you sat down to write this book, what were you hoping to deliver to the average reader?
Well, it became clear to me, the reason that I became passionate about this issue was because I was participating and following a lot of the debates and research that was coming out of the policymaking world in Washington. And it was just clear to me that there were important pieces of the conversation that were missing. We were having conversations about antitrust policy, about privacy, in silos. And, we were talking about them purely as domestic issues. But ultimately, because I believe that governments are using technologies to compete and ultimately struggle for political power, that these issues can't only be viewed as domestic issues. They have to factor in the broader geopolitical factors and landscape. And so I felt that it was very, very important to talk about that in order to help encourage a more thoughtful approach, ultimately to national security, but as well as on big domestic questions that I believe should bleed into our foreign policy, the foreign policy sphere.
Can we actually just linger on this for just one moment? Because I think about, your seat, what you were looking at, it's early 2010. All of this is kind of happening pretty quickly. We hadn't really seen anything like it. Google is a platform that receives over 63,000 search queries per second. A lot of people are using it. So in your time there, how did you end up creating a policy, or how did you end up working with the teams internally to figure out, okay, what information should be shown, what information shouldn't be shown? Like, how did you go about sorting that? What should remain versus what should be hidden?
So I'm actually happy that you bring that up, because this is often a point that gets misconstrued.
Okay.
The news policies, at least when I worked there, in the beginning of, in 2016 and in 2017, in those days, the philosophy at tech companies was still very much a philosophy that was skeptical of platform intervention in, over free speech. The policy that I worked on ultimately really was never designed to address quote unquote fake news in the broad sense, meaning it was not meant to address lies in politics, all lies in politics. It was not meant to fact check anything. It was really meant to focus on patterns of bad behavior. So it was meant to address the very narrow issue of when a foreign government is misrepresenting itself through activities in the US to American audiences. It was a policy that is grounded in precedent, in judicial precedent in the US, for example, through the Foreign Agents Registration Act that requires standards of transparency. If you're a foreign agent in the US, you are not allowed to conceal that. You're required to disclose it. And one example that I'll cite is during the time that I worked at Google, the Department of Justice actually asked and compelled Russia Today to register as a foreign agent, because they felt that Russia Today was not being forthcoming about the fact that it wasn't just an independent news publication, it was acting as a foreign agent in the US. So the basic idea of this policy was you can address the narrow issue of foreign interference by focusing on the question of is an actor engaging are you looking at a real world actor engaging in a pattern of behavior that amounts to this issue, which is that you have an actor that could potentially be engaged in misleading behavior, misrepresenting who they are. Right. And so it was never meant to be about veracity. It involved a lot of technical work, analytical work, in order to make robust conclusions about patterns of bad behavior. And but ultimately, it was focused on conduct, not content. So at no point was there any work done in order to make any kind of conclusions about veracity or truthiness or anything like that. Interesting. And I'm still very much a believer in that approach. I'm very skeptical and concerned when platforms get too much in the business of trying to fact check people.
Yeah, and just to continue this pit stop for a second, do you think that there are more people in Silicon Valley that have come to embrace your focus on conduct over content? From an outsider's perspective, when you read about censorship or filtering, what have you, it seems like the focus is still very much on content. What's your take on that, Jacob?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of content, and I actually think that's a loss. I think there have been so many cases just in the last 2 years where you see when I worked at tech companies, and I'm saying this, that I'm not saying that Google swung in that direction. I'm saying that the tech industry as a whole swung in that direction. And when I worked at Google, part of we were having a lot of conversations with people that engage in that ecosystem generally. People at think tanks, people. There was and continues to be a big public debate about content moderation. Yeah. And one of the important verticals of that debate was, what do you do with emerging theories, for example? The case where you have some crazy guy that says that the earth is round, and when the common consensus is that the world is flat, and everyone says that crazy guy is heretical, but actually it turns out that he's right. But there's a lag time between the time at which the guy comes out with his theory and the moment at which that theory becomes accepted as actually being valid. And so, if you have platforms that have an enormous amount of impact in public discourse, and those platforms deplatform heretics that put forth emerging theories, that's actually stifles the kind of public debate that we want to have. I mean, the whole point of the First Amendment is to protect unsavory speech. Speech that everyone agrees with doesn't need protecting. It's the speech that people disagree with that needs protecting. And so I've always found the emerging theories argument to be very compelling. We thought that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, had WMDs, in the early 2000s, until we realized he didn't. Right. People that questioned the origins of the coronavirus were labeled as the worst possible labels. Yep. And the intelligence community has even said that they can't rule that out as a possibility. And I know that a lot of people that have access to classified information believe that it did come from the coronavirus lab in Wuhan that was studying the coronaviruses. That It didn't come from the wet, the wet market that was a mile away. Right. So I think that the emerging theories argument was very compelling, and ultimately, I do worry that platforms are getting too much in the business of ascertaining, of splitting hairs, between what counts as politics, what counts as true, what counts as false. I think they should get back to a slightly more libertarian approach.
Maybe we can transition back to your book and unpack the choice of words you used here with the gray war. I think one of the biggest shifts in perspective I had reading this book was that the rivalry between the US and China is it's a risk to see it as just an economic competition, a sort of game where one country wins one year and loses the next year. You've made very clear choice here to call it a war. And I think, it is a strong word, but as you lay out the argument in the book, it's very much warranted. China and the US have two very fundamentally different visions for the world. As you write about, their long-term goals they're incompatible. How do you have a Western style democracy coexist with an autocratic superpower like China that's perpetually aiming to extend its sphere of influence? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you conceptualize the Gray War and perhaps go into where those key battlefields are being fought?
Sure. So the reason I call it a war is because I do think that a competition paints, a picture in a lot of people's minds as two tennis players that are playing on an equal footing along mutually agreed upon rules, but that ultimately can shake each other's hands at the end of a tennis match and coexist. The reason I don't think that paradigm applies with China is because we compete economically with Japan, with Germany, with lots of countries, and if Germany sells more cars, that doesn't pose as an existential threat to our system. With China, it's different because, first of all, China doesn't draw a clean boundary between its economics and its politics. Most of its companies are accountable to the CCP in a way that really doesn't exist in almost any other G20 economy. They have this civil military fusion doctrine that's very unique to China. And the other thing is that China and Russia, because they're autocratic countries, will inherently always view the US as a threat, because democracies, the whole point of a democracy is that it's premised on the idea that rules by a single person are illegitimate. So if we had a president that just waved his or her hand and started passing bills and had authoritarian power, we would view that as an illegitimate leader, rightfully so. Yeah. And so if you have a superpower in the world that is basically, stands for and represents the basic idea that your regime is illegitimate, you're going to do everything you can to try to discredit that power and roll back the influence that power has. And ultimately, that's exactly, Woodrow Wilson famously said, one of America's main foreign policy objectives is to make the world safe for democracy. What China wants is to make the world safe for the CCP. It just so happens that those two objectives are not compatible. You can't have a world that's safe for democracy and a world that's safe for the CCP. And so, much like during the Cold War, when you had a world that was divided into blocks because there was no reconcilable form of interdependence or governance between the Soviet Union and the US, I believe we're very much in that dynamic today. The differences are the fact that obviously technologies have drastically changed the landscape, which is why I choose to call it a gray war over a Cold War. And the second is that we are now approaching this new era on the heels of 20 years of policy that have basically completely entangled us economically with China, which ultimately I think was an absolutely awful mistake. It was a miscalculation that, at the time, it was a theory that peace through trade was a theory, and that ultimately China would become freer if it grew richer. It was a theory that was worth testing, but we should have course corrected far, far earlier, and we waited way too long. And now, unfortunately, we're facing a scenario where China is a near peer rival. By many estimates, it's not a near peer, it's actually a peer rival. And it's a very, very strong power militarily and economically. And untangling that intertwinement, decoupling, if we're going to do that quickly, we might have to look at a few years where it's going to probably cause a little bit of short-term pain before we get back to normalcy. And I think that could have been avoided with better upstream policies, but I digress.
No, Jacob, I think what we're something that needs to be said is that this is actually happening right now. I don't
Yeah.
think this is 2 or 3 years out. I mean,
It
your book
is.
was written
It
2 years ago, and the reason I'm saying that is because many people may not realize that this type of war is going on, and it's already hit our homeland. So it's just different than other wars in terms of like your typical bomb. But the fact that it's not only China, but Russia pouring billions of dollars into these campaigns to twist information, to divide, to distract. China's already hacked into some of our systems. So, I mean, this is really going on as we speak.
Mhm.
And it's not even just here. It's like China, what they're doing around the world. I mean, they want to control the information networks. If you see how they're building the infrastructure around the world, they're basically controlling all of 5G.
Yeah.
And it's not even attacking us. I think it's even like, what's interesting about China, which I learned from your book, is that they're neighbored by 14 countries,
Yeah.
which is really
Yeah.
interesting to think about in terms of the dynamics of how you have to play that card.
Yeah.
And when I read that, they're also attacking India and, turning down their electric grid and shutting off power and trains to like cities that are, have 20 million people. This is happening around the world as we speak.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be a little bit more urgency because
Yes.
after reading your book, in my mind, I don't see a way how this doesn't become more full-fledged, and I don't see a way how we don't start to adopt some more surveillance. And I don't want to say it, but like I hope we don't adopt some of the authoritarian behavior that countries like Russia and China are, putting out in the world. But after reading your book, I feel like the trend is going that way. So my question is, how do you think Americans are going to react when they realize life is very different from what it used to be? Like being an American is not the same as it used to be. And I think that needs to be talked about because the world is changing so rapidly.
So rapidly. And I think I hope a silver line, a whole chapter of my book is called the Sputnik Moment. And a lot of people in the foreign policy community have been trying to find, what is the Sputnik moment that's going to inspire and cause that sense of urgency to actually move Congress to pass a big legislation, to really take on this challenge head on, and also to end these debates about, are we in a Cold War? Are we not in a Cold War? And I think I was really hoping that China's launch of the hypersonic missile, which I think was a watershed moment, was going to be that Sputnik moment. And really, it really should have been. We should have had a Sputnik moment before that, but I thought that was big enough that surely that would be the Sputnik moment. It did not have the kind of, it caused a profound sense of alarm among the national security wonky, national security professional working class, but it did not really resonate in the American psyche in a broad-based way, the way that Sputnik did. With that being said, my hope is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to cause people to realize that the question today is not whether or not we're in a Cold War, but whether or not the Cold War that we're already in is going to turn into a hot war, because that is really what's at stake right now. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I find it incredibly frustrating how we had satellite imagery for months, over a year, of Russia stockpiling enormous forces all along its border with Ukraine. And it wasn't just tanks and airplanes, although they were stockpiling those. It was building hospitals, building blood transfusion centers, building airports. Clearly they had every intention of invading, because you don't spend, Russia is an economy that, it's an economy that's not, it's not a very wealthy country on a per capita basis.
Yeah.
If they're going to spend those types of resources, I doubt it would have been hard to imagine a scenario where Vladimir Putin would have said, all right, let's pack it up, gentlemen. We found a diplomatic solution, dismantle all the airports and all the hospitals. And the level of denial that our national security professionals were in, that they waited until November to basically, come out and say, we think that there's an imminent invasion of Ukraine. I think coming out publicly with the intelligence, by the way, was actually the right thing to do. I think it helped restore trust in our intelligence services, both at home as well as, overseas. I think showing our overseas partner that we were, because our overseas partner also didn't believe us initially. They thought, Americans are over exaggerating. And it really showed them that actually we were operating off of good information. But I think we should have never waited that long. We should have been arming and supplying the Ukraine with the types of weapons that could have helped deter this invasion in the first place. Now, the fact that we waited, now so now all the countries want to supply Ukraine. Even Germany said, usually we only give them parachutes and medicine because we are, have historical traumas and we want to provide non-lethal aid.
Yeah.
But now Schultz even said we're going to revisit that and we're going to supply them with lethal aid. So that's great, but now the challenge that they're facing because they waited so long is how do you actually get military aid in the hands of Ukrainians through an airspace that has Russian fighter jets? It's very, very hard now that you have Russian fighter jets in the air in Ukraine. How do you actually get the aid to Ukrainians? So that means that you're going to have to land the aid in a neighboring country, truck it into Ukraine, smuggling it through the border. This could have been avoided if we had actually taken action a year ago, which we should have done.
I feel like it's like our bluff was kind of called because, for 20 years, Putin has warned that, inclusion of Ukraine in NATO was going to be that final line for him. And in his perspective, when that, all this talk recently happened, I think he had no choice but to go forward with what he had been saying for 2 decades. And then what I'm also thinking is this is such a tragic situation because folks are getting displaced, folks are getting killed on both sides. There's so many people around the world that are upset. And part of me thinks it's like what they want you to see on screen. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, there's this entire cyber war that's taking place. So what you're seeing on screen is the war in your traditional sense. And really what might be happening behind the scenes is on a much deeper level where the new warfare is taking place, which we're not really talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And in any war, there's going to be the fog of war. So, things that we don't actually see, but that's taking place on the battlefield. And an interesting development is that President Zelensky actually he basically called on Ukrainian hackers to help, hack Russia, basically. And so I thought that was a very interesting development because I think this is going to be very much symptomatic of a new trend that you're going to see in warfare generally, which is the enlisting of hackers in order to go after an opponent. And this was also very consistent with, I had a whole chapter, one of the ideas that I put forth in my book as a policy recommendation towards the end of the book was actually helping arm and train digital freedom fighters, quote unquote. And this wouldn't be a clandestine, group of people, but for example, one of the methods of deterrence that a country like Ukraine or Taiwan could use is having an army that has very advanced cyber capabilities because cyber is asymmetric. We don't even have to send, you can avoid the issue of, you don't need Ukrainian airspace to train Ukrainian hackers. So it's very, if we wanted, for example, to send missiles to Taiwan, China could intercept it, they could find out about it. It's much easier to, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I mean, I think we should, but it should be an all of the above strategy. And I think because cyber capabilities are asymmetric, if China threatens to make a move on Taiwan, it can only help Taiwan if Taiwan has the ability to, a credible capability to, for example, go after China's electric grid, which is something that with advanced cyber capabilities, you don't have to be a large country to do, a large scale, to a high impact attack like that. You just have to have really good hackers, and we could, help enhance deterrence.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It does feel like, reading about the sort of onslaught of Russian cyber attacks throughout the years, it makes me wonder why we haven't returned the favor in kind. And just listening to the news over the last couple of weeks, a lot of people are talking about risk of Russia retaliating with cyber warfare to these pretty severe sanctions. And my thought is, if we have all this military might, if our GDP is orders of magnitude bigger than theirs, why aren't our capabilities with respect to cyber warfare so much more formidable than Russia's? Can you speak to that at all, Jacob?
I mean, I know that there are quite a few things that we do behind the scenes that we don't talk about, but I do agree with you that, generally speaking, I think one of the things that has done us quite a bit of, has really put us at a disadvantage is, I think we have a tendency, ever since the Iraq War, to spend a little bit too much time being afraid of how our adversaries are going to retaliate, and we don't spend enough time thinking about why our adversaries should fear us. I think us being deterred by our adversaries really isn't going to create an environment that's conducive to peace and security. I think some of the most peaceful times that we've had really in the world, and certainly in American history, in modern history, are times when, the US was actually respected and, in some cases feared by bad actors abroad. And so having a healthy amount of fear, I don't think should be a bad word. I think it's just, I would like Putin to fear the United States more. And I think that would ultimately be a safer world. And I don't think that should be a controversial thing to say. And ultimately, instilling fear in an adversary is not going to happen if we have, a disarmament echo chamber in Washington that is constantly proning less weapons, disarming. We all would like a disarmed, peaceful world. That would be the ideal. But unfortunately, as we've seen with Ukraine, the world, there is good and evil in the world, and we shouldn't pretend like those two things don't exist. There's also a lot of gray. I'm not saying that, it's just binary, but it's, we can't pretend like peaceful methods will ultimately create peaceful outcomes. Sometimes peace through strength actually does work.
So, in this world where like cutting edge technology like AI, quantum computing, they're going to be quote unquote the weapons of a cyber war. Where are we relative to the world in those technologies, in our rankings? I'm just curious, we're equipped with the right creativity in some of our departments that will allow for us to have a spirit that gets us through this type of warfare. Like when I read your book, I felt like we were really behind on a lot of things. We're really behind on how we're building infrastructure around the world. We're really behind on even control of cables. It felt like we were really behind on AI and quantum computing. What can you tell us that's going to help us feel better around our capabilities to stay ahead on this front?
So the good news is that we have some of the very best entrepreneurs and companies worldwide, which is an enormous source of strength for the US. Because we are a pluralistic, open democracy, we have benefited enormously from attracting some of the best and brightest talent from around the world, which have really produced so many contributions to our country and so many innovations. And the interesting feature of that, though, is because we are an open democracy, our private sector is not a puppet of the US government. And so our best and brightest innovations are not inherently in the hands of the DoD. And so we do have a system that does require the kind of public-private voluntary partnership, because we don't have laws that stipulate that if you are an American company, you are required by law to hand over all of your best technology to the government. That's not how our system works.
Not yet.
So, yeah, exactly. And so to that extent, I mean, China has the disadvantage that China has is that it has shown that it's a system that is uncomfortable with levels with entrepreneurs that become so successful that they could represent an alternative power base inside of China. China has shown that they don't like that and they won't stand for it. And therefore, if you're an ambitious entrepreneur, success looks very different in a world where if you become too successful, you might get hit over the head with a hammer by the CCP. And so that, I think that was a really big mistake that they made, but that ultimately, this is a feature of authoritarian government. It's very hard when you're in an authoritarian government to have to tolerate an alternative power base. Our strength is that we welcome, we are a decentralized system of government. Political power is decentralized between a judiciary, a legislative, an executive branch. We have a free press. We have very successful entrepreneurs here that are, given free rein to undertake new ideas, and we welcome that. And so, but in order to maintain that system and keep that system alive in a world where it's being threatened by autocratic powers, we really do need more collaboration between the private and the public sector in this country.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I did want to make sure we hit on one of the other big points in your book. I mean, kind of got the name of the book from the subject. Huge shift in perspective for me came from this idea that much of cyber warfare is to be fought on the back end of the internet. We're used to thinking of our data as living in the quote unquote cloud, and that invites this image of this internet that's this kind of like intangible network of radio waves. But as you write in the book, in actuality, there is no internet without the very real hardware that facilitates it. The idea of it being a kind of system of tubes, network of tubes, really isn't that bad of an analogy. There's the underwater cables that carry information across oceans, and whoever controls that hardware really has the ability to interfere with the front end output of the internet. Can you tell us a little bit about how China is working to control a greater share of that infrastructure, not only in the developed, but also in the developing worlds? And what are the implications of that as China tries to extend its reach throughout these infrastructure projects?
Absolutely. So as you point out, the gray war that I talk about, and if I could actually just, before I go into responding to your question,
sure,
segue a little bit into the reason that I called it a gray war is because it's the name of the concept is built off of the concept of gray zone conflict, which is the basic idea that war and peace aren't binary, but are a spectrum. And military strategists often talk about gray zone conflict as military, strategic struggles that take place in the murky gray zone between war and peace. It's, George Orwell, for example, defined the Cold War as a peace that is no peace. And gray zone conflict is very much part and parcel of that concept. And so, and ultimately, one of the questions that I asked myself when I was writing the book was, what do you call a world where one of the predominant pervasive features of international politics is gray zone conflict? And ultimately, that's why I decided to call it, a gray war, and war for the reasons that, we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When I unpack the concept of the gray war, I talk about how there is the software layer of the internet, the front end, the part of the internet that people see on the surface of their screens, which is the part, that often that people often refer to, that people often see through the prism of foreign interference that we talked about at the beginning of our chat. And then on the back end, which is the one that you just asked about, that's the physical infrastructure of the internet. And China has subsidized to the tune of $75 billion the production of Huawei fiber optic cable equipment, not out of political philanthropy or the good of their heart, but because they see a real strategic benefit to exporting Huawei around the world. And as a lot of intelligence officials have concluded, that benefit is backdoors into the hardware that might allow China to basically control everything that runs on top of Huawei infrastructure. And the reason that I think that that is ultimately the most concerning front of the gray war is because it will fundamentally change our traditional conception of national sovereignty. Because when you have a foreign government that is able to know all those deepest, darkest secrets of all the judges, journalists, and politicians in your country, you effectively have a vassal satellite state that is far less politically independent than in a country where people are allowed to live freely without a foreign government watching over their shoulder. And so, it's not just a espionage problem, but it's also an intellectual property problem. It's also the fact that China would be able to manipulate the data. There is in the book, I talk about a report by KPN, which is a Dutch telecom, that ran an analysis of cybersecurity analysis of Huawei's telecommunications network. And they concluded, this was back in the early 2010s, they concluded that Huawei had access and was able to intercept all of the phone numbers that people were dialing on Huawei infrastructure, including members of the Dutch parliament, all the content of conversations. So it's incredibly far-reaching.
Yeah. And
ultimately, if we want to live in a country that's free, where we're allowed to have disagreements and conversations like this one, it's critically important to replace, rip out Huawei equipment and frankly replace it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is how they're trying to put down the new Silk Road. And just to give the perspective around data, pulling from your book, if all the data traveling through data centers in a year were stacked in books, it would reach from Earth to the moon and back more than 113,000 times. And that's the type, wrap your mind around that and then realize that we have a country here on the planet who's just trying to dominate all that data and really just go at it with whatever they're able to dig into,
Yeah. And you talk about too in the book that data is fuel for algorithms. So on the one hand, you actually have the construction of the algorithm that determines the quality of it. But on the other hand, if you can have kind of a subpar algorithm with an insane amount of data running into it, you could theoretically end up with a superior algorithm. So by virtue of the kind of surveillance state that China has created, just the incredible abundance of data they're collecting on their people, and now it seems like people beyond their borders as well, that's to their advantage in the AI race.
Yeah, that is definitely an advantage they have. I'm a bit of a techno-utopian, so I think, I have a tendency to think that every problem has a technological solution, which makes me a little bit optimistic about.
No, we appreciate the optimism. Yeah. No,
I try to be optimistic about, this is the challenge, but we can find some sort of innovation. We can innovate our way out of this challenge. And you can point to, okay, we have less people, therefore we have less user data, but we can create synthetic data, which some companies have started doing to train algorithms. But we can't be complacent and ignore the fact that they are doing things to really put their best foot forward, and we should really do the same thing.
Well, in the book, you one of the most compelling few pages that I found in it were this sort of 2049 dystopian vision of China. If everything proceeds as it has, and the tentacles of their infrastructure continue to creep into other parts of the world. It was obviously a pretty terrifying vision you painted, but just kind of compelling from a narrative perspective. I'm curious, while you're here with us, Jacob, if you think about the 2049 where everything has gone well in terms of preservation of Western democracy and liberal order? And like, what does that 2049 look like? What's the bull case for the US?
The bull case in the US is, so China will have you believe that that ultimately the winner of this new Cold War or Gray War is going to be the country that has the most people, because the country that has the most people is going to have the biggest economy. That's kind of the main, argument for the bull case of China. The bull case for the US is that ultimately the winner of the Gray War or the Cold War isn't just about how many people do you have, but it's about how many people want to live in your system and prefer your system of governance. And ultimately, I think what you're seeing in Ukraine is that there are a lot of people out there that don't want to live in a dictatorship, is the reality. I mean, Ukrainians are taking to the streets, fighting. Yeah. I don't know if you saw the photos of the mayor of Kyiv taking a machine gun and Miss Ukraine going out on the street fighting.
Wow. No, I've not. I will look that up immediately after we get off this call.
It's actually pretty inspiring. I mean, this is someone who, was in a beauty pageant and she's now holding an AK-47. I mean,
wow.
But I think that speaks for these people are ready to fight, because ultimately Vladimir Putin offers a political vision of Ukraine that people simply don't want. They like their independence. They want to be able to live in a free country. And ultimately, I think that they're not alone. And Xi Jinping has made a lot of enemies in China. And whether or not he is going to be successful in exporting his political vision abroad at a time when China is becoming more dystopian, more authoritarian, more oppressive, I dare to believe that more people in this world will ultimately want to live free than unfree. And so ultimately, I think that is the bull case for the US, is that it's really not just about people, but it's about the fact that you have a greater amount of people in this world that don't want to live in a dystopian authoritarian internet. And the weakness in the Chinese government that you can see with the naked eye is Xi Jinping is a guy who boasts himself in front of the world, surrounded by masses of armed men, tanks, missiles, in these large, grandiose palatial conference halls, and yet he is terrified of an ounce of free thought and word. Yeah. And they go out of their way to extinguish any kind of free thought that rubs against their authoritarian sensitivities. And that, I think, is the Achilles heel that ultimately can undo their system of government.
I feel like that is a really optimistic view. I mean, just the counterpoint to that is just the trend. Let's say it is 2049. Where is deep learning going to be? Where are the deep fakes going to be? I mean, what type of visual and speech mimicry is going to take place in 27 years from now? My point is, like, how are we actually going to operate when everything's you're not going to be able to distinguish what's real or not? So we can be as optimistic as possible. I'm really curious around, like, what is going to stop this trend? And it might be people standing up like they are, recently, but I think there's got to be something more than that. And I don't know if I have the answer. So I'm putting it out there.
Well, with respect to deep fakes, I mean, sometimes it's hard to forecast innovations that don't exist yet. The impact of how certain innovations are, the impact that some innovations are going to have if those innovations haven't materialized yet. But for example, when I worked at Google, this was before Web3 became an incredibly hot topic. The tech industry was really in the grips of figuring out, how are deepfakes and more generally synthetic media going to impact content online, and just the information ecosystem.
Right.
And an interesting thing is that in the last 2 years, with the advent of Web3, Web3 actually offers potentially a world where if you have a decentralized information infrastructure, it becomes much easier to authenticate things because Web3 fundamentally is a ledger. And so that could potentially, this could be an innovation that actually helps address the issue of deepfakes. If you have, cell phone cameras that store images on a Web3, system, on a decentralized Web3 system, it might, create an opening for authenticated, verified, imagery that, allows people to know for sure that a given piece of imagery is actually real.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
but this gets back at my techno utopian. I always try to find, an innovation to solve a problem. So
yeah, no, I like it. I like it. Well, I know we've been kind of bouncing around a little bit, but just thinking about what's going on in the Ukraine for one more minute here. We're talking at 5:30 Pacific on February 28th for anyone listening in the future. But looking at it from like the optimistic side, the pessimistic side, what is kind of your best case scenario in terms of the outcome here with Ukraine, and what's the worst case scenario? Maybe let's just say over the next couple of weeks, because it's hard to predict the knock-on effects of whatever happens.
The best case scenario is the Ukrainians successfully deny Russia a victory and are able to basically deny Russia a victory, and in the process really deal a blow to Vladimir Putin. I mean, it would be very embarrassing for him to fail, frankly, which he might try to save face by, negotiating some sort of agreement with Ukraine and then calling it a victory. But if Ukraine is able to essentially retain its independence and thwart Vladimir Putin's attempt to annex Ukraine, that would be a momentous achievement. The worst case scenario is Russia succeeds and kills Zelensky and quote unquote denazifies Ukraine, which is something that they've openly said that they want to do. Putin has gotten a taste of success and starts to set his sights on other parts of Eastern Europe. And China feels emboldened to test the boundaries with Taiwan and potentially other contested territories. People focus a lot on Taiwan, but it's important to remember China shares a border with 14 countries, but it has a border dispute with 17 countries. So wow. Taiwan's a big piece of this, but there are 17 other places where China could try to make a move, as we saw with the border skirmish with India. And so the worst case scenario is you're basically looking at a two-front crisis in two totally different geographic theaters, one in Eastern Europe and one in the Pacific. And the US, scrambles to try to figure out how to respond. The encouraging development is the speed at which Europe and the US have actually rallied to come to Ukraine's defense. I mean, this war has only been going on for a few days. And in just a few days, Western Europe has really done a 180 in terms of providing lethal aid to Ukraine and, coming around. So one would hope that if a crisis materialized in the Pacific, that you would see similar urgency. With that being said, I think that we see the writing on the wall that all the ingredients and elements of a potential crisis are already in place. I mean, the kind of military buildup that Russia engaged in on the border with Ukraine is completely equivalent to the kind of military buildup that China is engaging across the Strait of Taiwan. We know it. We've seen the military drills. We've seen them conduct simulations of attacks on aircraft carriers that look just like American aircraft carriers. We've seen all these things. We've seen them, conduct drills that are designed to replicate, invasions of Taiwan's presidential palace. So we know all of these things. So I don't understand why at this point we are still, too slow to provide Taiwan with lethal aid. So, I would end with that, which is that I think at this point, everyone understands that it would be unreasonable and untenable for the US to act as the world's policeman, but that it is perfectly reasonable, and I would argue necessary, for the US to, at the very least, be the world's arsenal of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well
and
said.
Something like this, yeah, that was so well said. Something like this takes, folks out of a sleepwalking state and at least into a more aware state of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jacob, I know we're at the bottom of the hour. We do have one final question that we ask all our guests, just taking off our analytical hats for a second here. Hopefully we're not putting you on the spot, but what is the one thing that you love most about yourself, Jacob?
I think the one thing that I love most about myself would be, this is going to sound cheesy, but I'd say my family and the kids that my husband and I have. They're incredibly adorable, and they're 7 months old, and I find it inspiring to watch them grow incredibly fast.
That's
awesome.
Beautiful.
Family over everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Well, the book is The Wires of War. Again, phenomenal read. Arjun and I both got so much out of it. It'll give you perspective on where America's at, where Russia's at, where China's at, in a way that you're not going to get from the headlines. Obviously, it's front of mind for everyone right now. So digging a layer deeper and seeing how the last 10 years have gotten us to the point we're at now, I think is really beneficial for any reader out there. Jacob, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jacob.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.